Welcome back. We're going to continue talking about wilderness wandering and the problem of complaining. And today we want to look back at the book of Exodus and chapter 32. And remember, we're trying to learn about our modern day complaining and looking back at the past to not replicate the mistakes and errors they made back then. Consider 1 Corinthians 10. Now these things took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. To not be idolaters as some of them were, as it's written, these people sat down to eat and drink, rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. And today we want to look at an example of blatant disobedience, and it all stemmed, again, from, you guessed it, complaining. Exodus 32 talks about the infamous golden calf story where Moses has taken them out of Egyptian captivity. They've crossed the Red Sea. Now they're finally at Mount Sinai, which incidentally, God had told Moses that when you bring them out, this will be my sign of the covenant to you that I'm on your side. You'll bring them back to Mount Sinai. They're at that point. They're going to make a covenant with God, and He's going to be their God. They're going to be His people. Everything's going to be awesome. And in the middle of that, there's this really weird, almost out of place golden calf out of nowhere. Exodus 32, 1 through 6. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what has become of him." So Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters. Bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears, brought them to Aaron. When he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf, and they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. You heard that last verse before? Yeah, we just read it in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And you have to love this pretend ignorance by the Israelites, right? Where did this Moses go? I don't know what happened to him. He's only been gone for like a week, if that. I mean, a few days. I mean, he's not dead. You've seen him. And what's worse is Aaron just plays along with it. "Oh, sure, bring me all your stuff and we'll make a new god. We'll actually even have a feast to," and this is what he calls him, "we'll have a feast to this new golden calf, the Lord." So as you can imagine, things do not go well. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, for your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf, have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.' And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it's a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, I may consume them, in order I may make a great nation out of you." And so, as we would expect, God is furious. He's just done all these things for them. He's brought them out of the land of Egypt. He's listened to their grumbling, and he hasn't said anything about it. He's filled every single one of their needs, and all of a sudden they've completely turned around to a different god, this false idol. And if you pay careful attention, he calls them stiff-necked. We would encourage you to go back and watch our other video about what being stiff-necked really means. But incredibly, Moses, when he has the chance to say, "Yeah, let's just start this whole thing over, God, you're right. I mean, this is not working out. They've already left you behind." Moses incredibly intercedes for this stubborn, complaining people. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'With evil intent did he bring them out to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your burning anger and relent this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," or Jacob, "your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, 'I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and all this land I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord relented from this disaster he had spoken of bringing on his people." Two things we really need to pay attention to that Moses says here. First, he says, "the people that you have brought out of Egypt." Remember back in this last section, the Lord says, "These people that Moses, that he has brought out of Egypt." And Moses turns around and says, "I didn't do anything. You are the one who deserves that credit," number one. Number two, he doesn't say, "Have mercy on this people because they're so good." He says, have mercy on them because you promised their forefathers that land. Don't wipe them out because that would look bad on you, Lord. And when Moses confronted Aaron about this situation, Aaron completely drops the ball and denies any responsibility. He says things like, well, you know how stubborn these people are. You know that they complained to me, so I just did what they asked me to do, and they gave me all their gold, and I threw it in a fire. And he literally says, suddenly out popped this idol. What? Where did it come from? I don't know. I just threw the thing in it. How ridiculous is that? If you consider back what he says in the beginning of the chapter, it says that Aaron purposely himself built another altar to this false idol and declared it, this is your Lord who brought you out of Egypt. He had every part to do with it, but he wasn't willing to accept responsibility in that moment. And so Moses gathers up some guys, and they have to go take down these people who led this revolt, and it's a bloody affair, and that's just a consequence. Again, all of this was spawned because Israel at first complained to Aaron and said, where did this Moses guy go? So Aaron succumbed to complaining, and it led to these awful consequences for Israel. So what are some lessons we can take away from this weird story? First of all, Israel reverted back to what they had known before they were in God's presence. They reverted back to idol worship. And the same can be said about you and me. Before we were Christians, we did everything in the world that the world deemed was appropriate. We might go out drinking, and we might have inappropriate relationships, and part of that is we would just complain and gripe willy-nilly. But as the Bible makes it very clear in the New Testament, there is no room for complaining and endless negativity in the church. So a lot of times we have that same struggle where when we feel that stress or that worry or anxiety, the first thing that I want to do is revert back to what I've known before, which is complaining. We need to learn from Israel that it's not okay just to complain and do whatever we want to do. We're living a new life. We're new people now. We need to do what God wants us to do. Let's not build another false idol and claim it to be God. Number 2, the lesson we learn. It's possible for God to be in our presence and for us still to forget Him. If you consider the situation Israel was in, they were at the bottom of Mount Sinai and God was at the top. They could literally see God up on the top of the mountain. And even though they still saw God on the top of the mountain, they still made an idol for themselves. 2 Corinthians 3:16 says that the Spirit of God literally dwells inside of us. But sometimes His church still pretends like He's not around and that we've forgotten. Where did God go? We shouldn't believe that we are somehow immune to this whole false idol situation when Israel saw God right there. And lastly, this is why it is so important to continually renew our minds as Christians. Consider Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. The fact that humans complain is not a shocking revelation. We've complained since the beginning of time. But what Paul asks us to do in Romans 12 is to continually try to work away from what we've learned in the world and be transformed by the renewal of our minds. Consider again 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overcome you that's not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation He will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Consider this in your own life. Are you completely focused on God, or have you built some kind of false idol over here that you propped up to be God? If we're not careful and we listen too much to complaining, then eventually we start veering away from God's will and start building our own kingdom for ourselves. We build false idols and prop them up and say, this is the be-all, end-all, this is the God we should worship, when it's actually not God's will at all. Let me ask you this personally. Are you complaining in an attempt to build a false idol for yourself? Is God's will enough for you? Is following Him fulfilling to you in your life? It is. If it's not, then the answer is to focus back onto God. Stop your complaining and see the big picture, everything He's done for you.